Hello, my name is Lucy Fischer-West. I am sitting at my sunroom table in El Paso, Texas on February the 4th, 2022. I was born in Catskill, New York in 1949. I am the daughter of a Mexican mother and a German father, and therein lies a tale as to how they met. And if I could have connected to food for you, I would, but I simply can't connect. They're meeting in a bull ring to any kind of food, so I will just leave it at that and you can ask me later. Okay? So, this is my mother. My mother was Lucina Lara Rey Mendoza. She was born in Camargo, Chihuahua in 1910 on February the 2nd. And she started teaching when she was 14 years old. Now, my mother didn't meet my father until she was 36 years old. And when they married, they started out by living in Juarez. And then they went off, and I was born in Catskill, New York. And then my mother came back with me, my father followed. And really and truly, our first place of residence was my grandmother's house in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, in a colonia called Colonia Bellavista. So they lived in Colonia Bellavista with my grandmother for a good while until they moved to El Paso. Moved to El Paso by the time I was about 2 years old. The house that we lived in was situated directly across from where the Chamizal theater is at this point in time. And so that little adobe house is where my first food memories were shaped. My mother loved to cook. I think my mother loved to cook. I mean, when you are the homemaker in a 1950s kitchen, I mean, you do that. You did that. She cooked three meals a day as long as I can remember. And as long as I can remember, I have good memories of my mother cooking, but I also have a really good memory of my father appreciating her cooking. And every time my mother put a plate in front of my father, he would kiss her hand. And sometimes she goes, ah! But for the most part, she was grateful that he enjoyed her cooking as much as he did. So, food. Okay. So my mother had some very, very basic recipes that she followed. She was an excellent cook in my recollection, she was an excellent cook. And several things made her an excellent cook in retrospect, and thinking about how little she had in the way of resources, because we were dirt poor. Everybody in the neighborhood was dirt poor. So her resources were not fantastic, and she didn't drive. So we were limited to what groceries we could get by walking about a mile and a half, or by walking in the other direction. Now, if you can visualize where the Chamizal is now and Paisano Avenue, what was directly behind us was a canal that carried water from Elephant Butte Dam when it is released, and then at Mount Cristo Rey it redirects. So there was a canal behind the house, and the Rio Grande River was in front of the house. So we lived in a riverbed. So if you can visualize, to get groceries, we were either going to go south, get on a bus, go downtown, get on a trolley, and go to Juarez, get on another bus to go to the markets, and then do everything in reverse. Or we could walk a mile and a half to the closest grocery store, which would have been north of us, about maybe 5 streets north of us, and maybe 5 or 6 streets east of us. So we did that on a regular basis. And so, what she cooked when I look at it as an adult, what she cooked was pretty basic. There was always rice in the house. She made her Mexican rice. There were almost always beans in the house, cooked in a clay pot, which I still have. So that clay pot now is over half a century old. I wouldn't know how to cook beans in anything else except that clay pot. So those were there. Now, my father being German, he was happy with whatever my mother cooked, but he was especially grateful when she cooked something with pork in it. Pig's knuckles were a delicacy for him. For my mother to cook pig's knuckles and sauerkraut, it was, you knew it had to be a holiday because he loved that. But when my mother made chile rellenos, he was just as equally happy. Now, I call this my mother's magic fork. She had this funny looking fork with a wooden handle, and she'd take an ordinary soup plate and put egg whites in it to make the batter for chile rellenos. And so I can still hear the clinking of that fork, because what you would do was you could hear the clinking in the plate. And pretty soon you'd look over and she had this big frothy plate full of egg whites. And then she would add the yolks after that and dredge the chilies and all of the things that you do when you make chile rellenos. So she'd serve those chile rellenos to my father, and there could be 6 chile rellenos on a plate. And invariably my father got the hottest one. My father was very blonde and blue-eyed, and he'd sit at the table. His ears would start by getting really, really red hot, and his eyes would start to tear up. And my mother would say, well, I could switch it for you. You can try mine. It's not as hot. And he'd go, oh, no, I'm eating this one. This one is the one you gave me. This one is the one you offered to me. And so I'm eating this one. So my parents lived in the same house that I started out in on this side of the border, and lived very simple lives. I don't remember ever bringing home food like from a takeout place or something like that. Now, my mother and I brought things from the market in Juarez. I always called it our hunting expedition. Our hunting and gathering expedition. My grandmother lived in Juarez. If I'm going to situate you geographically, if you went across the border on the trolley, you wound up on 60th September and Lerdo Avenue, which is the approximate center of town. You had the Juarez market. If you got off the trolley at that point, you either went toward the Juarez market in one direction, or you went toward the Cuauhtemoc market in the other direction. My grandmother lived beyond the Cuauhtemoc market. And so on those hunting and gathering expeditions on foot, we would go from one end of Juarez to the other end of Juarez, getting our groceries and then bringing them home in reverse of how we got to Juarez. Then we would come back. And every once in a while, I thought my mother would strangle my father, because he would say, oh, you're back from your social event. And my mother would give him a look like, sure, carrying these heavy bags of groceries every week or every couple of weeks is surely a social event. So we would go. It was usually a Saturday because I was in school. We would go out, get groceries, go to Juarez, spend the day. And when we came back, the house would smell terrible to us, because my father would look in the fridge to make what he called chow mein. He'd take anything he could find in the refrigerator and put it in a skillet, saute it with whatever, and that was the way he fed himself lunch. But it always smelled like really bad Chinese food when we got home. So my father was not much of a cook. But my mother was so conscientious of him, his breadwinning responsibilities and everything, that when he worked the night shift for Falstaff Brewery, which was his very last job that he worked at till he was 75, she always left 2 eggs in a little saucepan for him on the stove, so that when he got home from work at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he would cook those eggs, soft boil those eggs, crack them, feed himself, and give our dog Daisy the last little bit in the eggshell, and she would very, very carefully eat the egg out of the eggshell, and then he was ready to call it a day. So those are the biggest memories I have of my parents and food in the house I grew up in. In 1970, I got married to an English professor, also a folklorist, John West, and there were things that I had, for lack of a better term, taken for granted in terms of my food traditions, that as a folklorist he was intent on capturing. And because he had such a community presence, it wasn't unusual for the Times or the Herald Post or any number of the television and radio stations to want to record him, and then later me, about food traditions here on the border. A lot of those food traditions wound up in his Mexican-American folklore book. So when we talk about tamales, my mother and I were used to making tamales every year. Now, when you think about making tamales, it generally involves several people. Well, if you're an only child like I was, the several people were never more than my mother and me and sometimes a helper. So John, being the folklorist that he was very insistent in taking pictures and Super 8 film of my mother making tamales. And while he was doing the filming and I was trying to help her make tamales, we did actually write down that recipe. And a lot of that recipe wound up in the paper during the winter for other people to see. So John was a Southerner, and the first time we went to Mississippi, I went to Mississippi to meet his family, it was an entire different world for me, because there were vegetables in Mississippi that his mother grew that I had never even seen before. And there were recipes traded back and forth, and the one memorable table that comes to my mind is of his aunt cooking for us. Of course, everything from scratch, with at least 1 or 2 meat dishes, and then like 7 vegetables. Mustard greens and beet greens and this and that and the other, and okra. Okra is not something that I stomach well, okay? It was like, it was just a little bit too slimy for me. And so, my next kind of food influence was what I picked up in trying to cook things that John liked. Now he had lived in El Paso for a long time, but he still liked the traditional Southern cooking. So I did learn to do things like chicken and dumplings and, cook lots of vegetables, etc., except for okra. So I came home from Mississippi with a new and different view on vegetables, okay? In my mother's kitchen, we had calabacitas, we had frijoles, especialmente de la olla, we had rice, but other vegetables were not as easy. I mean, sure, you had carrots and you had cucumbers in a salad, but the variety of vegetables that I ran into in Mississippi was just totally, totally new. And John, being the folklorist that he was, I also picked up reasons that you did particular foods at particular times. Okay, in my mother's Mexican kitchen, we had Lenten foods during Lent, and we had chicken soup when you were sick. And all of those kind of have stayed with me. I love Lenten foods. But for John, the whole business of having black-eyed peas on New Year's Day became a tradition. Black-eyed peas, cornbread, those were things that you always had in his background. I don't think you can form your food traditions all on your own. The influences are going to come from your life experiences. And when I asked him, well, why was having black-eyed peas a New Year's tradition? And he said that it came from the fact that in the summertime you grew your vegetables and you put them up. That was the term. You put them up, which meant that you canned them. And to us, canned means in a can. In his tradition, and traditionally I think for everybody, to can something meant that you put it in a jar and you put it in a pot and you vacuum packed it so that in the winter when you wanted vegetables, they were there. They were there stored more than likely in a cool place in your house. So if you had a household, particularly a household, of course, run by an efficient homemaker, then when winter came, you could pull out the vegetables, and you didn't do without vegetables because you couldn't grow them at the same time as you needed them. So if you had black-eyed peas that came from your cellar or from your pantry, that means that you planned ahead, that you prepared for the coming year. Therefore, you have black-eyed peas at New Year's so that you feel like you are prepared with your foodstuffs for the coming year. And so cornbread, black-eyed peas. I'm not big on putting ham hock in a pot of beans because I think it's too greasy, but that might be just me. I like my beans pure and simple, cooked in a clay pot with lots of garlic and enough salt to make them flavorful, and then just cook them until they're falling apart. So there you go. Okay, so one of the things that was very important to me as a mother was that I passed on traditions to our son. And he loved being in the kitchen. Okay? And as a lot of moms would do, especially at Christmas time, is that you bake cookies. And so it was, I think, one of the first real traditions that I think we maintained in the house was my making cookies with my son. But then, you can't have a mother who likes making tamales and not have your child want to continue in that tradition. And so this is probably one of my very, very favorite pictures of my mother and my son making tamales. So there was a lot of food cooked in this house because from the very beginning, I think, of our marriage, we had a social circle, and I did a lot of cooking for that social circle. And people asked me from time to time, why? And my But my answer was always that cooking was a way for us to gather. It's a whole lot more fun, at least in my estimation. It's a whole lot more fun to gather when you are cooking, when you are sharing stories across the table. And that was a real important part of this household, is gathering at a table with food and sharing stories. And you reveal a lot to each other at a table when you are sharing meals. And was it hard work sometimes? Yeah, it was hard work, but I like to cook, and I like to cook things that people like. And so therefore, it could be anything from a pot of beans or pozole or enchiladas or whatever, but I've always wanted to cook things that my friends liked. And the flip side of that is that I've always had friends who enjoy my cooking. And so it's a give and take kind of a thing. Cooking for somebody who appreciates your cooking is a treat. It might be work, but it's also a treat, and it's very rewarding. And when I cook and present a table of food, I really kind of remember my mother and my father and that connection in the kitchen, in cooking food, offering food, receiving food with gratitude. And that's the basis of a lot of the way, of the way that I think about food. So, my mother. So, in 1991, I lost my mother after a short but very painful illness. And we had made plans. I mean, we all make plans to do things with people. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't work out. She had always wanted to go to San Francisco. And so we had planned on going to San Francisco in December, during the December break, to start out 1992 in San Francisco. And unfortunately, she died in July of 1991. And so we had mixed feelings about doing the San Francisco trip. My son was about 16, 17 years old. And we decided we would go to San Francisco anyway. And San Francisco has fabulous restaurants, fabulous meals, fabulous scenery, fabulous everything. But the last thing that I ever thought would come out of San Francisco for me was meeting one of the most fabulous individuals I have the honor to meet. So here's the short story. We were on a tour bus going through Steinbeck country. Or was it Hemingway? No, Steinbeck, right? Steinbeck country. We're on a tour bus. I'm sitting next to my son in the front part of the bus, and a rock hits the window. A good-sized rock hits the window. And we watch as the whole glass next to us starts to have all those little crumbly cracks. And the bus driver says, "Is anything wrong?" And I said, "Well, sort of. We just had a rock hit the window." So he pulls over. And when he pulls over next to Pigeon Point Lighthouse. And he doesn't have a clue what to do. And John, who was walking with a cane by then, said, "Here, use my cane. We'll knock out the window, knock out the glass so that the glass doesn't fly into the bus." And so we knock out the window. And my son and I are holding this piece of plastic that we have retrieved from the beach. We're holding a piece of plastic against the glass. And I'm sort of leaning into the glass. And out of the corner of my eye, I keep seeing this white-haired lady in the back of the bus. And she's looking at me like, wow, you're keeping all of that wind from coming into all of us, but it must be really hard. And so the bus stops, and she comes up to me and she says, thank you for what you were doing. I'm traveling by myself. Can I have lunch with you? May I sit with you? And we said, of course. So we sit, and you do what you do on a trip. You talk about where you come from and all of this good stuff. And she tells us that she is on her first solo trip to the United States, having just been in Tahiti with her daughter. And so this is an extraordinary person. She was born in 1921. We met her in 1992 on New Year's Day. And the next thing we know, she's asking us to come visit her. And it's one of those things, you meet people on the bus, on a tour bus, and you go, let's not lose touch, stay in touch, come see us, da-dum-da-dum. Well, she was different. By the time we got home, there was already a packet of information about the place where she lived to entice us to come and see her. And so entice us she did. This is my friend Paulette Dupre. And she is standing in front of her summer home, which is in Gaverlac. Her summer home was in Gaverlac, which was a hamlet of about 3 homes in France. And I have to tell you that Paulette became like a second mother to me. She was vivacious, bubbly. She just to begin with, to be in her presence was a treat. And a scant 6 months after I lost my mother, it was like this person was sent to me by Providence. And so we did go see her in Gaverlac and enjoyed her cooking, enjoyed her love of the earth, She loved to garden. She loved to cook. She grew up in Reunion, which is off the coast of Madagascar, or close to Madagascar. Like I said, she was born in 1921, and she spent the war years in Reunion because they couldn't go home. But the first money that she earned was from the vegetables that she grew in Reunion. And her task at the family home was taking care of 212 rose bushes that were grown in her parents' home. And so I was very lucky, okay? When we talk about people canning food, okay, she was the consummate person to use the fruits of her garden and can hundreds of jars of fruit and vegetables. Sometimes she took them to the local farmer's market. She would get a real gleam in her eye when she'd say, "Oh, I took it to the farmer's market and people bought my plum jams." And she had this thing that she made with lemons, and it was kind of a relish. And so she would sit there and cut the lemons just exactly right, et cetera, to make this relish. But I was lucky enough to be in Gaverlac several summers, not for as long as one would like, but the one fantastic year that we were there when the fruit started ripening, then I got to pick red currants. I got to pick red currants. By this time, Paulette was not as healthy as she might have been. And so she had to sit and direct. And we picked fruit and ended the day. She always cooked. I mean, I remember the first time we were there as a family. And she said, well, I don't know what I'm gonna cook for supper for you. And we said, whatever, right? I mean, you always have bread in the house. You always have cheese in the house. And she says, no, just wait. So she goes out to the garden and she comes back with a basket full of courgettes, which we know as zucchini squash, calabacitas. If you're from around here, calabacitas. And so in less than 15 minutes, she had made courgette soup. And it was one of the first recipes that I brought back from France. And it's really, really simple. It's courgettes, enough water to cover them, some bouillon cubes, cook them, put them in the blender, get it as thick as you want, and add the Laughing Cow cheese. She made it with little wedges of Laughing Cow cheese, but you can substitute. You can substitute cream cheese if you want to do cream cheese. But that was the first recipe that she shared. Being in her garden was a little paradise. I mean, it was her passion to grow food in Gaverlac. At her home in Nîmes, where she spent the winter months because it's too cold in Gaverlac for her to be there. There, it was primarily a blossoming garden. But in Gaverlac, it was primarily vegetables. So I have many treasured memories from Paulette, including her handwritten recipes. And I have a lot of these recipes that I have yet to try.
What are some of the other recipes from Paulette that you've done here?
That I have done here. Okay, so Paulette, as far as her recipe, she used to say that I was a better cook than she was because I was more adventurous. But I mean, she came to El Paso only once because she said that at her age, she didn't like to repeat going to places more than once because there was so much of the world to see. And she knew that she had a limited number of years in which she could travel. And so when I invited her to come back, she apologized very demurely, but said, I really like to go to places only once because there's so much I want to see. And so I picked up from her the use of certain herbs, for example. I did not have a clue what tarragon was before I met Paulette. My mother used hojas de laurel, oregano, canela, cinnamon. Some of the very, very basics were what I saw in my mother's kitchen. But Paulette, with her fresh herbs in her garden, which were new to me, with tarragon especially, she used a lot of tarragon, but she also cooked a Creole kitchen, a Creole food, because she was Creole. And so you bring in all the what I would call the red spices, because there's a kick to them. There's an earthiness to the way that she cooked. One of the last meals that I had the last time we were there was a boar's leg that she cooked. She also used a lot of cod and taught us how to get the salt out of cod before you cooked cod. When I would ask her for a recipe, she would say, well, it's so simple. And I'd go, okay, so how simple is it? And she says, well, if you want to cook a rabbit, you take Dijon mustard, you clean the rabbit thoroughly and everything else, but then all you do is that you smear it with Dijon mustard and put it in the oven. And that Dijon mustard gives you all the flavoring that you need. So, but I'm remembering this petite woman, a total country woman, who would pick fruit in the afternoon, go to bed, and then get up at the crack of dawn and can all of that. And by the time I would get up the next morning, the sun would be coming through her window in Gaverlac, and she would have all these little jars of one kind or another of jam that she had already done by 7 o'clock the following morning. So those are my best memories of Paulette. A garden was not a new thing for me in Gaverlac with Paulette. My mother had a garden all of the years that I remember living in the house. She had a garden. Excuse me. She had florals inside, a bougainvillea, a jasmine plant, a shrimp plant, and she loved those. Outside, she had rose bushes and fruit trees. And, we had pretty decent apples, very good peaches, very good apricots from the garden and in my childhood home. And what you got to remember too is that she had 5 feet of space between the next door neighbor's house and the wall to our house. There was 5 feet of space. So that's all she had. And so in that space, she had all these fruit trees that just grew for her. So we have here in this house, there is a good sized garden, primarily with peach trees. I did try to grow vegetables, but I was not very successful, except one year. After I took a master gardening course, I decided, I'm going to be like one of these people who does her own composting and does this and does that. Well, it takes a lot of work to do all of that. And we did get a good amount of compost one year. And my son, who was here as a teenager, he said, we have to get a compost bin. And so we got a compost bin. And the one time that we felt we had enough compost, I said, well, what are we going to do now? And he said, well, we're going to just put it into the earth, right? And so we took the compost pile, which was very heavy, and put it in one place. And the summer after that, we had a tomato jungle. And that's the only time I've ever had real vegetables. But because seeds don't disintegrate in a compost pile, then you had lots of tomatoes. I had maybe 2 cantaloupes, but nothing like Paulette. I mean, Paulette had lavender-infused strawberries in one bed. Imagine that. Imagine the jam that came from lavender-infused strawberries. So, what I did with the garden is pretty basic. I do have a selection of herbs, and I really like to use them in the summertime, especially if I can find good tomatoes somewhere in this town, which has changed a lot in the years that I have cooked. It used to be that we went to Juarez for all of our vegetables, for all of our beef, and life got complicated. And after my mother died, it made me really sad to go to the butcher shop or the market where everybody knew us and not have my mother with me. And so my habits changed. And going to Juarez did not materialize much after that. All right, so in 1995, I saw a little piece in the paper that advertised or that called for volunteers to go to India. And it was only a little clip about this big. And it said that if you were interested in being a kind of ambassador for the Rotary Foundation, that you could apply and go to India. Well, being a sailor's daughter, I really had a desire to travel. And we had traveled a little bit, but certainly not as far as India. So here I am in India in my very, very best sari that one of my hosts put on me. And wearing a sari was for me like, wow, you put on that silk sari and you feel like $1 million. You really do. It was absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. Okay, so this is the way that the tour worked. We were there with the Rotary Foundation. There were 5 of us, 4 from New Mexico and only me from Texas, from El Paso. In the Western region, it was the Western region team. And so we were always housed with Rotarian families. And Calcutta is a huge city. And there were many Rotary clubs there. And so every Rotary club would take us, each Rotary club would take us for 4 or 5 days and share with us the projects that particular club was doing in Calcutta. One of them had in a basement, they made prosthesis for children, especially for children. They created wooden prostheses for children at a cost, an equivalent cost of $25 per prosthesis. And it was one of the projects that they wanted us to take home and tell people what that particular Rotary Club was doing. There was another one that took us out to a village that they had created not only a small medical facility, but a literacy facility. And so they took us out for that. And so that is, not that I had never eaten on the floor, but they had this really cool pavilion with a cement floor. And they showed us in and showed us the mats where we were going to sit down. And so we sat down, and there was no cutlery there. Absolutely no cutlery there. And we had been coached before we went. You do not use your left hand for anything. And so we were trained to sit with our left hand under us so that we would not be tempted to eat with our left hand, because that is unclean in the Indian way of thinking. And so there we are in the village, and we've got naan in front of us. We've got vegetables in front of us, and really only vegetables in that particular village. You don't eat beef in India. You don't eat pork in India. Occasionally you can have chicken. You can have chicken or fish. But in that particular setting, all we had was vegetables. And there are memories that mix as you're thinking about them in retrospect. And my mother would rather eat with a piece of tortilla than a fork. My father was a meticulous eater. He was a very, very European. Everything very precise with the fork and the knife and put in his mouth in a certain way. Now, my mother, by the time she sat down to eat, she'd have a half-burnt piece of tortilla, and she'd scoop it up. She'd scoop up the rice with the tortilla. And so, in India, I can't help but think of the similarities between the way my mother ate and the way these people in this village eat and other places, because you really kind of eat with your hands with naan. I was introduced to a thali in India, in the more fancy homes, where you have various dishes, and you can mix or not mix according to your like. And thalis, I thought, were absolutely wonderful. For breakfast, the family that I was staying with, we would sit out on the balcony, and they would bring out a breakfast thali with fruit and dried fruit and nuts and some kind of porridge or something, and that would be fantastic. Next to the last stop on that Rotary Foundation trip was to the Andaman Islands. Some of the Andaman Islands no longer exist as a result of one of the big tsunamis that happened there. So I have wondered if the families that I stayed with and got acquainted with made it to safety from the Andaman Islands. And so in the Andaman Islands, I got to cook. Everywhere else I got to eat. In the Andaman Islands, I got to cook. And it was just absolutely fun and wonderful. What we were making was little potato rolls. They're very, very much like hush puppies in the South. Or these little potato rolls, and you drop them in hot oil, and they're, they taste different than the cornbread-based hush puppies, but basically it was the same idea. So the big event for the downtown Rotary Club was a visit with Mother Teresa. And that was on January the 19th, 1995. So, Mother Teresa was an amazing woman. For anybody who knows her story, she was an amazing woman. And we were supposed to be there for 10 minutes, and instead we were there a whole lot longer. But this is my funny thing about Mother Teresa. Her assistant comes in from the back, and she takes me by the hand, and she says, "You need to sit right here," which was almost in the center. And I said, "Yes, ma'am. What do you say? You're in Mother Teresa's home, in one of her many homes. Somebody tells you just where to sit, you sit." And so then Mother Teresa comes from the back and pats me on the shoulder and says, "You're sitting in my chair." And I'm going, "Oh, I'm sitting in Mother Teresa's chair." And so she takes me by the hand and she swings me over to the next empty chair and continues to hold my hand. During all of her conversation, she is holding my hand. And I am looking at people around me and thinking, I can't even describe the feeling that I had, except that I was really conscious of the fact that not other people were having the same opportunity as I was having of sitting right next to Mother Teresa. And so we had been traveling for about a month together by that time, and so everybody pretty well knew that I could communicate with my eyes. And so everybody started turning and going and sitting briefly with her, and she never stopped talking. She talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. Answered questions very quickly. She had all this enthusiasm. And somebody in the group says, "Well, Mother T," she was known as Mother T to people who worked with her. They said, "So how did you get started doing this?" And other than the fact that she knew that it was a calling from God for her to serve the poor, she said, "Well," she says, "I saw a lot of hungry people and I couldn't feed them by myself. So at the beginning, I went door to door and asked people for a cup of rice, if they could spare a cup of dry rice. And so when you go door to door asking people for rice and they give it to you, then you can take it back to where there's a need and you can feed people. And pretty soon, people were giving me more than just a cup of rice. They were giving me more and more so that I could feed more and more people. And one of our team members said to her, well, how do we do that? I mean, can we send you things? And Mother Teresa snapped at this person. And she said, you don't send me things. You don't send things for me to use here. You go out in your community and you find where the needs are and you serve your community. And the poor girl just kind of goes, oh, yes, ma'am. Because she was a firm believer that you do good where you are. Yes, you can reach out beyond your limitations in your community. I'm a big believer in Heifer International, where they're addressing the needs of the hungry all over the world and have been doing that for 70 years. I'm a great believer in that, but I'm also a great believer in contributing to the hunger organizations that we have in El Paso. And so that visit was astounding. Mother Teresa talked. She talked a lot, really and truly. I mean, she barely took a breath. And the only time she let go of my hand in that conversation, and that lasted almost an hour, was when she had to use her hands. I mean, as a Mexican person, I use my hands a lot when I talk. And Mother Teresa, in her culture, also used her hands a lot. So she reached into a little box she had and gave us all miraculous medals that had been blessed. And she put miraculous medals in our hands, and of course we clutched them as treasures. And then we were supposed to go out, kind of stream out, and she shook hands with everybody except when she came to me. And when she came to me, she put one hand on my cheek and the other one on my head and brought me down to her level, because she was a tiny woman, and blessed me. And so that electricity going through my body is like forever there. And so that was my next kind of food influence, life influence. I learned to eat Indian food in India. I mean, how better to be introduced to an ethnic food than to where you have the most of. Again, we go back to the vegetables. There probably were not very many meals where we didn't have yellow lentils, dal. And the dal was mixed with other things, and you had spinach and you had some cheese. And I mean, that thali, that plate, that aluminum plate, always had the dal on it. And one of a very dear friend, after he heard about my experiences in India, gave me a Madhur Jaffrey Indian cookbook. And so I can cook a fairly decent Indian meal and love it. I love the way that the kitchen smells when you are baking something. Carnitas for the Mexican side, a pork roast for my father's side, my father's German side, tandoori chicken, and what this particular cook calls aluminum chicken. Aluminum chicken in aluminum foil, I think is what she calls it. I can't pronounce the Indian name, but the whole concept of this particular dish is that you take all these spices and ground almonds and you pat the whole chicken with all of this, and then you wrap it in foil and you put it in the oven, and when it comes out, it has absorbed all the spices and the almonds and everything else. So I don't know that I wouldn't have learned how to cook Indian food if one of my friends hadn't said, Lucy, have you ever cooked Indian food? And I'd probably have gone, no, but I'll give it a shot. But the influence of that trip, of course, was was a big influence. And I've been very fortunate. It hasn't been just India. It's been places like Barcelona, where I had one of the most delicious crepes in the whole world, made by an Argentinian cook in the market. It was the crepe with goat cheese and honey and fresh figs, and it was absolutely, absolutely one of the very best crepes I have ever had. I've had the good fortune to eat a very fancy meal in Scotland. And in the Mexican vein, I have also gotten very brave and gone beyond the standard Mexican food and learned how to cook chiles en nogada, which I had had only a couple of times before I decided, oh, I really should learn how to cook this. And so I did. And for me, chiles en nogada probably constitutes the most complex dish that I make, because it involves peeling that bitter skin off walnuts, and that is not easy to do. Even with fingernails, it's not easy to do, and it's very time consuming. If you're going to do it right, it's very time consuming. But that's probably, when I think about what do I cook that is the most labor intensive, it's probably chiles en nogada. And to be truthful, I did it once just to see if I could do it. And when I got done, I thought, I'm never going to do this again. And when I served it to our regular guests, because I had guests practically every month, we could find something to celebrate. And so I had the chiles en nogada, and I had gone to Juarez to get particular sorbets for dessert, and everybody was so crazy about that meal that I just had to do it again. And so I did it again several times. Haven't done it in a long time, but who knows, I might go back and do it one more time. Okay, so one of the experiences that I treasure most, that is probably uppermost in my food experiences, date-wise, chronologically, is having the pleasure of cooking with a chuck wagon crew. Those of you who are familiar with the West know that there were cattle drives that came through here that took several weeks to go through the range, and you always had to have a cook because cattle drivers had to be fed. And so they carried some food. The wagon was equipped for cooking in its own primitive way. So you cooked with firewood. You sometimes cooked with canned fruits. But it's an experience. The men have the hard part because they have to keep the fire going. They have to get the wagon off the trailer. It comes to where you're going to cook. And the first time that Dr. Abarca and I did chuck wagon cooking was in Anthony, New Mexico for Cowboy Day. I think that's what it was called. It was called Cowboy Day or something. Day of the Cowboy. That's what it was called. And we were dressed sort of appropriately. We at least had boots on and that kind of thing, and we had decent hats on. But what we didn't count on was the deluge. We were cooking what our friend Wayne Cock calls Johnny cakes, which are kind of a corn pancake. And we were happily cooking these Johnny cakes, and the rain came down, and he had to devise a way for those Johnny cakes not to get wet. It was so wet that the little tarp that he had over where we were cooking poured all the water down on what we were cooking. And so after that, he had to figure out a way for us to keep doing what we were doing. And so everybody's got a job when you're teaming up with a truck wagon team. Everybody has a job. The men generally keep the fire going, and the head person, in this case Wayne, directs you on what you have to do. So in this picture, he's directing Dr. Abarca, Meredith. He's directing Meredith on how to make these Johnny cakes. And she did a fine job, let me tell you. She did a fine job of making those Johnny cakes. And then here I am trying to coax a person to eat those Johnny cakes, because we were giving them away as part of this Day of the Cowboy, and people were looking at us like, don't you want us to pay you for them? And we'd go, no, we want you to try this creation from this primitive way of cooking. And so we did that. We did Day of the Cowboy, and then we also did Lincoln County Days, and we did another chuck wagon event in Fredericksburg. And for that one, what I was supposed to do for that one was come up with a dessert for 50 people, 100 people, something like that. And so I did, and we served our dessert. This is our team. This is Wayne Koch and Skip Clark and Meredith Abarca and I, kind of catching our breath after our cooking. This is the best picture I can give you of a chuck wagon and what it looks like. Growing up in El Paso, I was very much aware that everything that you bought generally came from maybe a place close to the source. You could drive and find a vegetable stand somewhere close by. Growing up not in the Segundo Barrio, but in what they then called the Barrio del Diablo, it was not unusual for the vegetable guy to come in his wagon and come to the neighborhood for you to buy your vegetables. And that was always a treat. I mean, the same thing was going on in my grandmother's house in Juarez. I mean, you would start hearing people call that they were selling tomates, verduras, anything and everything was on those wagons. And in her neighborhood, those wagons were pulled by a mule or a horse. In the neighborhood where I grew up, it was generally a little pickup truck where you raised the flaps and you had all these vegetables to choose from. Like I said, my mother didn't drive, so we had to depend on the grocery stores and such that were close by, or make those trips to Juarez for our hunting and gathering expeditions. Sadly, in the time that I have lived here and I have been aware of how things change, we used to drive to Las Cruces, to Mesilla, for example, and everything on one side of the road was farmland. Both sides of the roads were farmland, particularly corn. And now it's buildings. And now it's buildings going all the way into Mesilla. You could go to Country Club Road and buy vegetables from the person that had grown them behind where he had set up his stand. And I miss that. I think it was a remarkable experience to get vegetables that were really, really fresh. We always bought beef in Juarez. We bought fish in Juarez. We don't do that anymore. It's just not something that we as a family are comfortable doing, going to Juarez just to do that. We didn't eat out a lot when I was growing up. If we ate out at all, It was going to be after church. Church usually let out about 12:30, quarter to 1. And sometimes people would get together, and the standard places we would go eat would be cafeterias. We would go to Luby's or to Wyatt's at that point. There was another one close to our house called Parkins Cafeteria in Clardy Fox, which would have been the closest one that we had to where we lived. So we did that. If we wanted Chinese food, we went to Juarez. We went to Shangri-La, or we wanted to one of the other well-known restaurants on Avenida Hermanos Escobar. And so my father loved Chinese food. So he didn't drive a lot. You got to remember that I wasn't born until my father was 56 or 57 years old. So by the time I was old enough to drive, he was happy for me to drive. And so we would go to Juarez on a Sunday to eat Chinese food or to go to Julio's Café Corona. Those were the two. If we wanted Mexican food in Juarez, we went to Julio's Café Corona. And if we wanted Chinese food, then we would, chances are we would go to those two places. Now, if my mother and I were shopping in Juarez, then we would go into the little tiny booths that people set up in the market. You know, the kind where people are standing right at the door to their little puestecito, and they come out and they say, "Ándale, señoritas, vénganse a comer caldo." You know, those kinds of places were where we would eat all the time. The restaurant scene has changed a lot in El Paso in my lifetime. Gentrification is what I see. Most of the restaurants that you saw in my growing up years were local restaurants. A lot of Mexican restaurants, you know, a couple or two Indian restaurants, some German restaurants. You didn't have a chain fast food restaurant everywhere you looked. I mean, you really can't drive anywhere here without seeing the gentrification that has happened in the food scene in El Paso, in my mind. You still have some long-standing Mexican restaurants like Leo's. Pancho's disappeared, which was another favorite of a lot of people. But things have changed. I mean, we loved Jackson's, for example, and Jackson's was around for a long time, and then it went away. So what else can I tell you?
Where do you normally go to eat when you eat out nowadays?
When we eat out these days, we are as likely to wind up at Ruli's International Kitchen as anywhere else. I mean, it's close to home. The food is always good. He is very knowledgeable and very personable and does really great things with food. So we are likely to go there. If we want like a real fancy meal, we graduated from Ardovino's Pizza Parlor on Cincinnati Street, which was a mainstay for a long time for us because we lived close by, to Ardovino's Desert Crossing, which is a product of that same family. At the moment, I can't remember anything beyond that. We did take, for only special occasions, we would take my parents to Cattleman's Steakhouse, which we still do from time to time. We go for special occasions. And my father, being the person, enthusiastic and always grateful person that he was, used to say when he had a steak at Cattleman's, he used to look at that steak, finish the steak, and then he'd say, "Well, if we ever have another depression, I will live on the memory of this steak."
That's great. The last question, as we reflected about food in your life, restaurants in El Paso, how do you define food? What does food mean to you? What does feeding people in your house means to you? If you could just give us a synopsis of what that actually means to you, that would be great.
I can't do it. No, just kidding. Okay, so what does food mean to me? Well, For me, food is a blessing. It is a blessing that carries a responsibility. I think that the concept of noblesse oblige in terms of giving what you have, of if you have a surplus of something, then you ought to be able to give to other people. And that's not just, in my mind, that's not just feeding the hungry in a literal sense. The people that I have brought together to our table in this house have been longtime friends, family and friends, and we genuinely enjoy their company. And so it has been a privilege to share the food that was in this house with people. It's an offering. When I cook, it's an offering to people that bless my table. Because the people that bless my table are the people that I love to cook for, love to eat, love to talk, love being together. And I don't know that I have something profound to say about food, but I needed help in finding the essence of what I wanted to say. And here it goes. This is from Henri Nouwen, a Catholic priest from the Netherlands. He says, when we invite friends for a meal, we do much more than offer them food for their bodies. We offer friendship, fellowship, good conversation, intimacy, and closeness. When we say, help yourself, take some more, don't be shy, have another glass, we offer our guests not only our food and drink, but also ourselves. A spiritual bond grows, and we become food and drink for one another.